8.6 Resonance. This is the Lewis structure we would draw for ozone, O3. But this is at odds with the true observed structure of ozone, in which both oxygen-oxygen bonds are the same length. It's been experimentally discovered that the bond length in ozone is 1.278 angstroms for both bonds. Both outer oxygens also have a charge of -1/2. One Lewis structure cannot accurately depict a molecule like ozone. We use multiple structures, resonance structures, to describe the molecule. Just as green is a synthesis of blue and yellow, ozone is a synthesis of these two resonance structures. In truth, the electrons that form the second carbon to oxygen bond in the double bonds below do not always sit between that carbon and that oxygen, but rather can move among the two oxygens and the carbon. They are not localized, they are called delocalized electrons. The organic compound benzene, C6H6, has two resonance structures. It is commonly depicted as a hexagon with a circle inside to signify the delocalized electrons moving in the ring. Sample exercise 8.10, resonance structures. Which is predicted to have the shorter sulfur-oxygen bonds, SO3 or SO3-2. The sulfur atom has 6 valence electrons, as does oxygen. Thus, SO3 contains 24 valence electrons in all. In writing the Lewis structure, we see that 3 equivalent resonance structures can be drawn. As was the case for NO3-, the actual structure of SO3 is an equal blend of all three. Thus, each sulfur to oxygen bond distance should be about 1/3 of the way between that of a single and that of a double bond. That is, they should be shorter than single bonds, but not as short as double bonds. The SO3-2 ion has 26 electrons, which leads to a Lewis structure in which all the sulfur-oxygen bonds are single bonds. There are no other reasonable Lewis structures for this ion. It can be described quite well by a single Lewis structure rather than by multiple resonance structures. Our analysis of the Lewis structures leads us to conclude that SO3 should have the shorter sulfur-oxygen bonds and SO3-2 the longer ones. This conclusion is correct. The experimentally measured sulfur-oxygen bond lengths are 1.42 angstroms in SO3 and 1.51 angstroms in SO3-2. For practice, please draw 2 equivalent resonance structures for the formate ion.
In this video, I'd like to explain resonance theory for Lewis structures. If 2 or more Lewis structures for a covalent compound or a polyatomic ion can be drawn, those Lewis structures are so-called resonance structures. Covalent compounds or polyatomic ions with double bonds are the most likely candidates. Resonance structures do not actually exist. We draw resonance structures to help us rationalize experimental data, in particular bond length. Shown here is the Lewis structure for ozone. But if one looks carefully at this Lewis structure, one could see it's possible the double bond between the 2 oxygens on the right could be between the 2 oxygens on the left, if we were able to distinguish among these oxygens isotopically. If that's the case, then, that the double bond could be between the other 2 oxygens, we could come up with another Lewis structure for ozone. These 2 Lewis structures are called resonance structures, and it's customary to put a double-headed arrow between 2 resonance structures. Data from experiments show the bond lengths between the oxygens are all the same. This figure shows the two fictitious resonance structures for ozone. And below the two structures is a realistic structure. Notice the dashed line and the single bonds. This alternative Lewis structure with the dashed line is consistent with experimental data. The next example is nitrate. The Lewis structure for nitrate is shown here. We have three oxygens. Two of them have a single bond, one of them have a double bond. If we were able to distinguish among these three oxygens, we can move the double bond among these three oxygens. And one could come up with three different Lewis structures for nitrate. Experiments show that the bond length between the nitrogen and the oxygens are all the same. Therefore, the realistic Lewis structure would be represented as this Lewis structure. In this Lewis structure, we see that the bond lengths between the nitrogen and the oxygens are all the same. The last example I'll show is benzene. Here is the Lewis structure for benzene. And to the right of the Lewis structure is something called a line angle diagram, a more customary way of representing benzene. Like the previous examples, the double bonds in benzene can be moved around the molecule. If we consider that, we'll come up with two resonance structures for benzene. The bond lengths are the same between all of the carbons. Therefore, a more realistic Lewis structure for benzene is represented with this figure. This Lewis structure is more consistent with experimental data for bond length, where it was determined that the bond lengths between the carbon are all equal.